Tonight, we're going through the major infections in Resident Evil, looking at where they came from, how they work, what they do, and how they fit into the wider story. So get comfortable, put this on in the background, and let's go through every major Resident Evil infection. Part 1. The Progenitor Virus, the root of Resident Evil's entire viral family tree. Almost every virus this franchise is known for traces back to a single source. Progenitor sits at the root of the family tree, the biological material Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus found tied to the stairway of the sunflower in Africa. G-related research, T-Veronica, and eventually Uroboros all connect back through this one origin point, even as each later strain develops its own distinct properties. What made Progenitor difficult to use directly was compatibility. Exposure alone didn't reliably produce anything useful. Most people who came into contact with the raw virus simply died, their bodies unable to handle whatever biological demands it placed on them. Only a narrow range of genetic compatibility allowed a host to survive exposure at all, let alone gain anything resembling an advantageous mutation. That unpredictability is exactly why decades of subsequent research exist. Umbrella's scientists spent years modifying, refining, and branching off from the original organism precisely because working with it directly was too unreliable to build a weapons program around. Every derivative strain covered later in this history represents an attempt to solve that same core problem in a different way. One distinction matters before going any further. Not every infection in this franchise descends from Progenitor. The fungal mold and megamycete lineage runs entirely separate, a different biological family altogether, and treating every pathogen as a variation on this one root organism would misrepresent how the science actually branches. Part 2. The Stairway of the Sun. Why one flower created an entire bioweapons industry. Long before it became the foundation of a global bioweapons industry, the Stairway of the Sun was simply a flower growing in an isolated part of Africa, tied to a cave system that had kept it largely undisturbed for an enormous stretch of time. Its historical isolation is part of what made it so significant once modern researchers finally found it. Nothing about it had been studied, catalogued, or exploited by anyone with the scientific tools to understand what it actually was. Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford recognized something in that flower none of the local history around it had ever needed to name scientifically. Its connection to the cave system beneath it suggested a biological phenomenon far more extensive than a single unusual plant, something rooted deep in the surrounding environment rather than confined to one specimen. Their reaction to the discovery wasn't measured curiosity. It was closer to recognition that they'd stumbled onto something extraordinary, a naturally occurring biological source capable of reshaping human biology in ways nothing else available to them at the time came close to matching. That distinction deserves emphasis. Umbrella's entire early viral program starts with something nature had already produced. The company didn't invent this phenomenon in a lab. It found something that already existed and spent decades afterward learning how to bend it toward its own purposes. Part 3. Why Progenitor doesn't simply turn everyone into a zombie. Raw Progenitor exposure creates a genuinely difficult scientific problem, one this history keeps returning to in different forms. The virus doesn't produce a consistent, repeatable outcome across different hosts. Compatibility determines almost everything, and most people simply don't have it. For a host lacking the right genetic profile, exposure tends to end in death rather than transformation. The virus overwhelms the body faster than it can adapt, producing catastrophic failure instead of anything resembling a useful mutation. Even among the smaller group of people who survive exposure, surviving and gaining an advantageous ability aren't the same outcome. Some hosts live through infection without developing anything Umbrella's researchers would have considered a successful result. This is exactly why decades of Progenitor-derived research exist, instead of the company simply weaponizing the original virus and moving on. Raw Progenitor was too unpredictable to build a reliable weapons program around. and researchers spent years modifying it into more consistent, more controllable strains, rather than working with the source material directly. None of this comes with a detailed scientific explanation for exactly why compatibility varies the way it does. The games establish the pattern without spelling out the underlying mechanism in molecular terms. And that gap belongs to the actual canon rather than to a failure of research. Part 4. Mother Miranda's megamycete, the other biological family tree. Everything covered so far belongs to one biological tradition. The megamycete belongs to an entirely different one. Mother Miranda discovered this organism beneath her village decades before Umbrella's Africa expedition ever took place. And it shares nothing meaningful with Progenitor, beyond both eventually producing dangerous biological weapons. The megamycete is fungal rather than viral, a massive underground network Miranda found while searching for some way to bring her daughter Eva back after losing her to the 1918 influenza pandemic. Its defining property sets it apart from every virus this history traces elsewhere, an ability to preserve information tied to living things that come into contact with it. That preservation property is what eventually makes the mold in the Cadou possible, decades after Miranda's original discovery. Her research into this organism ran on an entirely separate track from anything happening inside Umbrella during the same period, driven by personal grief rather than corporate ambition. This is the point where two major biological branches need to be held apart rather than folded into one story. Progenitor and its descendants make up one lineage. The megamycete and everything that eventually grows from it make up another. And confusing the two, or treating every pathogen in this franchise as some version of the T-Virus, misses how genuinely different these two scientific traditions actually are. Part 5. The T-Virus. How Progenitor became Umbrella's first great weapon. James Marcus took Progenitor's raw, unpredictable material and turned it into something Umbrella could actually build a program around. The T-Virus was his answer to the compatibility problem covered earlier, a refined strain capable of producing more consistent results across a wider range of hosts than the source material ever managed on its own. The letter T in the virus's name refers to Tyrant, and that detail matters more than it might first appear. Marcus wasn't simply trying to create a zombie plague. His research aimed considerably higher, toward producing a combat-capable bioorganic weapon. With the zombie outbreaks, this franchise became famous for representing more of a side effect than the actual goal. T's core biological properties center on cellular mutation, tissue regeneration beyond anything ordinary human biology allows, and a dramatically increased metabolism that demands far more energy than a normal body requires. Those three properties, working together, are what eventually make both zombification and the Tyrant program possible from the same underlying research. Umbrella's own creature archive identifies the Tyrant project as the actual central purpose behind T-Virus research, not an afterthought layered on top of a virus originally meant for something else. Every zombie outbreak this franchise depicts grew out of research that was aimed, from the very beginning, at building something far more deliberate than an uncontrolled infection. Part 6. Why the T-Virus creates zombies instead of simply killing its victims. Infection with the T-Virus doesn't kill a host outright the way raw Progenitor tends to. Instead, it sets off a progression, tissue decay spreading through the body alongside significant neurological damage, gradually stripping away higher brain function while leaving enough of the body operational to keep moving. Appetite changes drive much of what makes an infected host so dangerous. The virus's demand for energy doesn't disappear once a body starts decaying. If anything, that demand grows more extreme, pushing infected hosts toward relentless, aggressive feeding behavior even as their bodies continue breaking down around them. That combination, a corpse-like body still requiring enormous fuel, is exactly what defines the zombie as this franchise depicts it. Umbrella's own creature archive describes these infected humans as undergoing mutation and progressive decay, while consuming flesh specifically to sustain an altered metabolism the virus has forced onto their bodies. Understanding zombies this way reframes them as a biological consequence rather than a simple horror trope. The relentless hunger, the decaying body, the loss of higher reasoning, all of it traces back to specific effects the virus has on tissue, brain function, and metabolic demand, working together to produce exactly the creature this franchise built its early reputation on. Part 7. T-virus infection doesn't always produce zombies. Zombies get most of the attention, but they represent only one possible outcome of T-virus exposure. Animals infected with the same virus frequently produce something very different. Dogs become Cerberus, aggressive and durable in ways ordinary canine biology never allows. Sharks become Neptune. Snakes become Yawn. Each species responds to the same underlying virus according to its own distinct physiology. Gigantism shows up repeatedly among non-human hosts in ways it almost never does among infected humans. Stinger and the giant moth both demonstrate this pattern clearly. Their bodies growing to sizes that would be biologically impossible without the virus's influence on cellular growth and structure. Umbrella's own archive explicitly notes gigantism as a common effect the T-virus produces specifically in non-human hosts. This variation demonstrates something important about how the virus actually functions. Host species, existing physiology, and any experimental intervention applied during exposure all shape the eventual result far more than the virus itself dictates on its own. The T-virus doesn't carry one fixed outcome. It carries a set of biological possibilities that depend heavily on what body it happens to be working with. Understanding this range matters for everything else this history covers regarding T-virus-derived creatures. A zombie and a giant moth share the exact same underlying infection. What separates them isn't a different virus. It's a different starting body responding to that virus in its own way. Part 8. The Hunter Program. How Umbrella turned infection into a purpose-built creature. Not every T-virus creature emerged from uncontrolled infection spreading through an unlucky population. Hunters represent something deliberately engineered from the ground up. Combining the virus with genetic modification, specifically designed to produce a purpose-built combat creature, rather than relying on whatever an ordinary infected human might randomly become. Umbrella's researchers weren't satisfied with zombies as a combat solution. Zombies were slow, unpredictable, and limited in tactical usefulness. Hunters solved that problem directly, engineered from the start for speed, raw physical strength, and consistent aggression, qualities that made them considerably more reliable as an actual combat asset than anything infection alone tended to produce. This distinction matters for understanding how Umbrella's weapons program actually operated. Infection as disease, and infection as a deliberate component in engineered weapon production represent two very different processes, even when both draw from the same underlying T-virus research. A zombie outbreak happens to a population. A hunter gets built. Recognizing hunters as manufactured rather than incidental changes how their existence should be read within Umbrella's broader research. They weren't a side effect the company simply took advantage of once it appeared. They were a specific engineering goal, pursued deliberately using the same viral foundation everything else in this section traces back to. Part 9. The Tyrant, the T-virus's real end goal. Everything covered in this section eventually points toward one destination. The Tyrant program represents what Marcus's original research was actually aimed at achieving. A creature capable of surviving T-virus mutation without collapsing into the kind of chaotic instability that made so many of Umbrella's earlier experiments unusable. Getting there took years of failure. A stable human host capable of enduring the mutation process without losing basic function proved far harder to produce than Umbrella's early researchers likely expected. The proto-tyrant stands as clear evidence of how much work remained even after significant progress had already been made. Its exposed organs and limited intelligence showing exactly where the research still fell short of what the company was actually chasing. Umbrella's own archive identifies the proto-tyrant as an early attempt at what the company internally described in terms suggesting an ultimate combat-capable life form, tying the letter T directly back to this specific objective rather than treating it as an incidental naming choice. The zombie outbreaks this franchise built its reputation on were never the actual goal. They were closer to an unwanted byproduct of research, aimed considerably higher. Later, more refined Tyrant models would eventually close much of the gap the proto-Tyrant exposed. But that refinement took years and considerable additional loss, each iteration teaching Umbrella's researchers something the previous attempt had failed to demonstrate on its own. Part 10. Lickers. What happens when a zombie keeps mutating? A zombie isn't necessarily a finished result. Left to continue mutating under the right conditions, an infected human can progress considerably further than the shambling, decaying state most people associate with T-virus infection, eventually becoming something closer to an entirely different organism. Lickers represent exactly that outcome. The transformation strips away recognizable human skin entirely, leaving exposed muscle tissue in its place. Senses shift dramatically as well, with hearing and other perceptive capabilities becoming considerably more acute than anything a zombie or an ordinary human retains. Claws replace hands suited for anything resembling normal function. And an enormous, exposed tongue becomes one of the creature's most recognizable and most dangerous features. Calling a licker simply a stronger zombie undersells what advanced mutation actually produces. The changes go well beyond an increase in raw power. They represent a fundamentally different organism, one whose entire sensory and physical structure has reorganized itself around a completely different way of hunting and surviving compared to the zombie it once was. Later licker variants complicate this picture further, produced through additional viral manipulation layered onto the base mutation, rather than emerging from unassisted progression alone. Those variants demonstrate that even a creature this far removed from its original human host still has room for deliberate scientific refinement. Part 11. The T-virus can infect animals through secondary exposure. Not every infected animal in this franchise resulted from a deliberate injection carried out inside an Umbrella laboratory. Secondary exposure accounts for a significant share of the infected wildlife that shows up throughout the series. Animals contracting the virus simply by interacting with an environment or a food source already contaminated by it. Crows demonstrate this route particularly clearly. Feeding on infected flesh gives them a path to contracting the T-virus without anyone deliberately targeting them for experimentation. Once infected, their behavior shifts noticeably, aggression increasing well beyond anything ordinary crow behavior would produce, turning an unremarkable scavenger into a genuine threat within an outbreak zone. Umbrella's own material documents this secondary infection pathway directly, confirming that the virus doesn't require controlled laboratory exposure to spread between species. Scavengers feeding on contaminated remains represent one of the more mundane, and in some ways more disturbing, ways this virus propagates through an ecosystem, once containment has already failed. This detail matters for understanding how quickly an outbreak zone's danger compounds once the initial containment breach happens. A single contaminated corpse doesn't just represent one infected body. It represents a potential source of secondary infection for every scavenger that finds it, multiplying the threat well beyond whatever the original outbreak directly caused. The pattern also complicates any attempt to fully contain a T-virus outbreak once it reaches an open environment. Umbrella's researchers could control exposure inside a laboratory. They had far less ability to control which animals happened to encounter contaminated remains once infection escaped into the wider world. Part 12. The T-virus can produce giant insects. Among the more visually extreme outcomes T-virus exposure has produced, giant insects stand out for how dramatically they diverge from anything resembling their original species. The giant moth and stinger both demonstrate this effect clearly, their bodies scaled up to sizes that would be biologically impossible without the virus's influence on cellular growth. Gigantism doesn't affect every infected organism the same way, and insects seem particularly prone to this specific outcome compared to other classes of host, where an infected human tends toward decay and mutation without necessarily growing larger. An infected insect frequently does the opposite, its body expanding well past any natural limit its species would otherwise be bound by. This divergence matters for understanding the T-virus's overall unpredictability. The same underlying infection produces catastrophic physical breakdown in some hosts and explosive, uncontrolled growth in others. Nothing about the virus guarantees a single, standardized outcome once it takes hold. And insect hosts represent one of the clearest demonstrations of just how far that unpredictability can swing. Beyond their unsettling size, these creatures also tend to retain enough of their original biological function to remain genuinely dangerous rather than simply becoming larger, slower versions of an ordinary insect. Stinger's venom and the giant moth's own toxic properties scale up alongside their size, compounding rather than simply exaggerating the danger their original species already represented. Umbrella's research into these outcomes appears to have been more incidental than deliberately pursued. Insect gigantism showing up as a documented consequence of exposure rather than a specific engineering goal the way hunters or tyrants were. That distinction places these creatures closer to uncontrolled biological side effects than purpose-built weapons. Part 13. Why some humans become useful B.O.W.s while others become zombies. Pulling together everything covered across this section so far, one question keeps resurfacing. The same underlying T-virus produces wildly different results depending on circumstances, and understanding why requires looking at several factors working together rather than any single explanation on its own. Compatibility sits at the foundation of this variation, echoing the same problem progenitor exposure demonstrated earlier in this history. Not every body responds to viral exposure the same way, and a host's underlying genetic makeup plays a significant role in determining whether infection produces a useful mutation, uncontrolled decay, or outright death. Experimental preparation matters just as much as raw biological compatibility. Hunters and tyrants didn't emerge from simple exposure. They resulted from deliberate genetic engineering applied alongside the virus, shaping the outcome toward a specific, predetermined goal, rather than leaving the result to chance the way an ordinary zombie outbreak does. Host biology itself, separate from genetic compatibility specifically, adds another layer of variation. Species, existing physiology, and even individual variation within a single species all influence what a given exposure eventually produces, which is exactly why the same virus generates zombies among ordinary infected humans and giant insects among certain infected arthropods. This combination of factors answers one of the central questions running underneath this entire era of Resident Evil's history. Umbrella never had one single, predictable outcome to work with. Every T-virus application involved managing an enormous range of possible results, and the company's entire weapons program grew out of learning to work with, rather than eliminate, that fundamental unpredictability. Part 14. TJCCC-203. The T-virus was once tested as a cancer treatment. Among the more obscure strains connected to T-virus research, TJCCC-203 stands out for how far it diverges from the weaponized applications most of this history covers. Introduced through Outbreak File Number 2, this variant wasn't developed as a weapon at all. It was designed as an experimental oncolytic treatment intended to attack cancerous cells directly rather than produce a combat-capable creature. The strain's development took place through hospital trials, with patients suffering from cancer serving as the human subjects for this line of research, whatever legitimate medical promise the treatment may have carried. The consequences when it failed proved genuinely horrifying, mutation replacing whatever therapeutic effect the researchers had originally hoped for. This detail deserves careful handling given how obscure the source material actually is. What's clear is that Umbrella pursued a genuine medical application using T-virus-derived research, rather than every single strain connected to the virus existing purely for weapons development. The company's pharmaceutical cover wasn't entirely fictional. That distinction matters for understanding Umbrella's actual research culture, rather than simplifying it into pure weapons development dressed up as medicine. Real medical ambition apparently existed alongside the weapons program, built on the exact same biological foundation, and the fact that this particular treatment failed catastrophically doesn't erase the fact that curing cancer seems to have been a genuine goal behind it. Whether this specific strain ever moved beyond these hospital trials into any broader application isn't something the available material clarifies. The documented history here is narrow, centered on this one hospital and this one failed treatment, without extending into a larger, more developed research program the way most other T-virus derivatives eventually did. Part 15, TJCCC203, shows how Umbrella hid human testing behind medicine. Beyond the specific biology of the strain itself, TJCCC203 reveals something significant about how Umbrella actually structured its human testing operations. This wasn't research conducted openly under the company's own name. It moved through shell corporations and illegal clinical trials, conducted at a hospital in the Arclay region undercover that kept its true nature hidden from anyone outside the small circle actually running it. Patients receiving what they believed was legitimate cancer treatment became unwitting biological test subjects, without any understanding of what was actually being done to them. This mirrors a pattern this history has already traced through other early Umbrella experiments. Vulnerable people treated as resources, rather than as patients deserving informed consent about what they were actually receiving. The medical data harvested from these trials didn't stay confined to cancer research either, given how tightly integrated Umbrella's various research programs tended to be. Information gathered here plausibly fed back into the company's broader weapons development, blurring the line between its legitimate and clandestine science even further than the pharmaceutical cover story alone already suggested. This overlap between legitimate medicine and hidden weapons research reflects the same underlying corporate structure this history established regarding Umbrella's founding purpose. The company wasn't simply hiding weapons research behind an unrelated medical front. Its actual medical research and its weapons research shared infrastructure, personnel, and, apparently, biological material drawn from the same underlying viral family. Understanding TJCC203 this way turns a fairly obscure strain into a meaningful data point about how deeply Umbrella's human testing culture extended, reaching into ordinary hospital patients who had no connection whatsoever to bioterrorism or corporate espionage. Simply people seeking treatment for an illness that had nothing to do with any of it. Part 16, Liquor. T-Virus B.O.W. was experimented on with Progenitor. Liquor beta occupies an unusually specific place within this history, a creature whose documented case involves layering two entirely different generations of viral research onto the same biological weapon. Umbrella's own archive identifies it as a T-virus derived B.O.W. that a Tricell researcher, working well after Umbrella's own collapse, later exposed to Progenitor in an attempt to further improve its capabilities. That decision represents something genuinely unusual within this history's broader pattern of research. Most creatures covered throughout this documentary derive from a single generation of viral development, refined and modified, but still fundamentally built on one underlying biological foundation. Liquor beta instead combines an already existing T-virus creation with exposure to the much older, more volatile Progenitor source material. The resulting sensory changes reflect this layered exposure, altering the creature's capabilities beyond what a standard liquor's mutation typically produces. Combining a modern, refined T-virus product with raw Progenitor introduced properties the original virus alone hadn't accounted for. A genuine experiment in stacking different biological generations onto the same host, rather than starting research from scratch. This case matters as a rare documented example of exactly the kind of layered experimentation this franchise's broader history suggests happened more often than individual games ever directly depict. Tricell inheriting Umbrella's scattered research created opportunities for exactly this kind of combination. Researchers working with material from multiple prior generations, rather than confined to whatever single strain their own organization had originally developed. Beyond the specific sensory modifications involved, the deeper significance of liquor beta lies in what it confirms about how thoroughly Umbrella's various research generations remained available for recombination long after the company's own collapse. available to any organization willing to experiment with stacking one generation's B.O.W. product against an earlier generation's raw biological source. Part 17. The Nemesis infection is actually two biological systems working together. Nemesis tends to get remembered as simply a more powerful, more relentless tyrant, but that framing misses what actually makes the creature distinct at a biological level. Nemesis isn't a single infection producing a single result. It combines two separate systems: a T-Virus-derived tyrant foundation and a distinct parasitic organism known as the NE-alpha parasite, working together rather than one simply being a stronger version of the other. The underlying tyrant biology provides the raw physical power and durability this franchise's earlier tyrant models had already demonstrated. Tracing back through the same research this section has already covered regarding T-002 and its predecessors. That foundation alone wasn't new. What made Nemesis different came from what got layered on top of it. The NE-alpha parasite adds something the Tyrant program had never managed to fully solve on its own. Functioning as a kind of supplementary brain, grafted onto the creature's existing biology. This addition raised the creature's overall intelligence considerably beyond what earlier Tyrant models demonstrated, while also permitting external control that let Umbrella's European researchers direct its behavior with far more precision than a standard Tyrant ever allowed. Umbrella's own archive material describes this two-part system directly, treating the Tyrant Foundation and the NE-alpha parasite as distinct components, rather than describing Nemesis simply as an upgraded infection. That distinction matters for understanding Nemesis as a genuinely different category of creation, rather than the next incremental step in Tyrant development. This combination explains why Nemesis behaved so differently from every earlier Tyrant this franchise had introduced. It wasn't simply stronger. It was smarter, more directable, and capable of pursuing a specific target with a level of coordination the underlying T-virus biology alone had never been able to produce on its own. Part 18. NE-alpha was designed to solve the Tyrant's biggest weakness. Every Tyrant model covered earlier in this history shared a persistent limitation. Raw combat power meant relatively little if the creature couldn't be reliably directed toward a specific objective, and traditional Tyrants proved notoriously difficult to use as precision weapons despite their considerable physical capability. The NE-alpha parasite exists specifically to address that gap. Umbrella's European researchers, working on a problem the American Tyrant program had never fully solved, recognized that intelligence and controllability mattered just as much as raw destructive potential. A weapon capable of overwhelming force, but incapable of following anything resembling a coherent plan, wasn't actually the ideal outcome the company had originally been chasing since the earliest days of the Tyrant program. Grafting the NE-alpha parasite onto an existing Tyrant foundation gave researchers a way to improve cognitive function without needing to redesign the underlying biology from scratch. The parasite supplemented rather than replaced what the T-virus had already built, adding precisely the missing piece that had limited every previous Tyrant model's practical usefulness as a targeted weapon. This approach turns Nemesis into something closer to a genuine technological advancement in Umbrella's broader B.O.W. development, rather than simply a more dangerous monster introduced for a specific story. It represents a deliberate engineering solution to a problem the company had been struggling with since the very earliest Tyrant prototypes. Addressed through parasitic augmentation rather than through further viral refinement alone. Understanding NE-alpha this way connects Nemesis directly back to the broader arc this section has traced through the entire Tyrant program. From the unstable proto-Tyrant, through years of gradual refinement, finally arriving at a creature capable of the precision earlier models had always lacked. Achieved by combining two entirely different biological systems, rather than perfecting one on its own. Part 19. The G-Virus, a virus designed to rewrite the host's genetics. William Birkin's most significant creation represents a genuine departure from everything covered so far in this history, where the T-Virus causes mutation and decay without fundamentally altering what a host passes on to any offspring. The G-Virus was designed from the ground up to rewrite genetic information itself, carrying effects capable of propagating well beyond the original infected individual. Umbrella's own archive material states this distinction directly. G alters genetic information in a way that allows it to transmit through a host's descendants, a property the T-Virus simply doesn't possess. This reproductive capability sets G apart as something categorically different from a more powerful version of Marcus's original research, representing an entirely new direction in viral weapons development. Birkin's ambition with this research extended well beyond simply producing a stronger bioorganic weapon. He was pursuing genuine genetic transformation, a virus capable of reshaping not just the individual it infected, but potentially the biological future of anyone that individual might eventually have children with, a scope of ambition none of Umbrella's earlier viral programs had ever attempted. That reproductive property is exactly what makes later developments regarding Sherry's genetic compatibility so significant, rather than simply another dramatic plot detail. Her value to both her transformed father and to the broader scientific interest that eventually surrounds her stems directly from this specific property, one that separates G from every previous generation of viral research this history has traced. Understanding G through this genetic lens, rather than simply as a more powerful successor to T, reframes Birkin's entire body of work as a deliberate attempt to solve a problem no earlier Umbrella researcher had even fully articulated. Creating a virus whose danger wasn't confined to whoever happened to be directly exposed to it. Part 20. Lisa Trevor and the mysterious origin of G. Understanding where G actually came from requires returning to Lisa Trevor, whose decades of forced experimentation this history has already traced in considerable detail. Her body's connection to G's eventual emergence represents one of this franchise's most significant and most carefully preserved genuine mysteries. 2 decades of repeated viral exposure left Lisa with a resistance to mutation that Umbrella's own researchers found scientifically remarkable, her body surviving conditions that killed or catastrophically transformed nearly every other subject exposed to similar treatment. That resistance eventually became associated with G's development, though the precise mechanism connecting her biology to Birkin's eventual breakthrough remains genuinely unclear. Umbrella's own archive preserves this uncertainty rather than resolving it. The material states directly that it remains unknown whether G resulted from combining multiple pathogens administered to Lisa across her years of experimentation, or from some other, unidentified factor within her own unique biology that no amount of testing ever fully explained. This ambiguity deserves to stay exactly where the source material leaves it, rather than getting filled in with an invented, tidy explanation. Lisa's connection to G is confirmed. The specific biological pathway connecting her repeated exposure to Birkin's eventual research isn't. And treating that gap as solved would misrepresent what this franchise's own canon actually establishes. What remains clear, regardless of the unresolved mechanism, is the human cost underlying this breakthrough. Whatever combination of factors eventually produced G, it grew out of 2 decades spent treating one woman's body as a resource to be repeatedly exploited. A fact that stays true no matter how the precise scientific mechanism connecting her to Birkin's research eventually gets understood. Part 21. Why William Birkin injected himself with G. Birkin's decision to inject himself with his own creation didn't emerge from confidence or scientific curiosity. It emerged from desperation. Triggered the moment Umbrella's recovery team arrived at his laboratory demanding control over research he'd spent years developing and considered, in a very real sense, his own, facing the prospect of losing everything to a company he no longer fully trusted. Birkin chose to make the virus and its creator inseparable, injecting himself rather than surrendering the sample to a team sent specifically to secure it under Umbrella's direct control. This wasn't a controlled scientific test. It was a last resort carried out under enormous pressure and very little time to consider the consequences. The mutation that followed moved fast, stripping away recognizable human anatomy at a pace far beyond what Birkin himself likely anticipated when he made the decision. Rather than gaining controlled power over his own transformation, he lost himself to it almost immediately. Whatever remained of his original identity, increasingly buried beneath the biological changes G forced onto his body. What emerged continued seeking hosts capable of sustaining further reproduction of the infection, even as Birkin's own recognizable humanity disappeared. This reflects the reproductive drive covered in the previous section directly. The creature's behavior oriented around propagating the virus, rather than simply surviving as an individual organism, the way a T-virus zombie's more limited biology tends toward. Birkin's transformation stands as one of this franchise's clearest examples of a scientist becoming consumed by his own research, not metaphorically, but literally. His desperate attempt to protect his life's work resulting in the complete loss of the man who had created it in the first place. Part 22. The G-virus doesn't behave like an ordinary infection. Most infections covered throughout this history eventually settle into something resembling a stable end state, a zombie, a hunter, a tyrant, each representing a more or less final form the virus produces once mutation runs its course. G doesn't follow that pattern. Rather than stabilizing, it continues driving progressive mutation well beyond what most other viral infections in this franchise ever demonstrate. Tissue exposed to G keeps growing and changing rather than settling into a fixed configuration, meaning a host infected with the virus doesn't simply transform once and remain in that new state indefinitely. New growth and further mutation can continue occurring as the infection progresses, producing a creature whose form keeps shifting rather than arriving at anything resembling a completed, stable result. William Birkin's own transformation demonstrates this pattern more clearly than any other documented case. Rather than reaching one final monstrous form and remaining there, he passes through multiple distinct stages, each one representing further mutation layered on top of whatever the virus had already done to him, his body never actually settling into a single, fixed state throughout the entire ordeal. This near-continuous mutation sets G apart from the T-virus's more predictable progression covered earlier in this history, where T tends to produce a relatively stable end result once decay and transformation run their course. G keeps pushing a host's biology further, making the virus considerably harder to study, predict, or eventually counter using conventional research methods. Understanding this ongoing instability matters for grasping why G proved so much more dangerous to contain than earlier umbrella research. Even setting aside its reproductive properties, a virus that keeps changing its own effects doesn't just threaten whoever it initially infects. It threatens anyone trying to study or counter it, since whatever understanding researchers manage to build during one stage of infection may no longer apply once the host mutates further. Part 23. Sherry wasn't just a victim, she was G's reproductive target. Sherry Birkin's ordeal connects directly back to the reproductive property that separates G from every earlier virus this history has covered. William's attempt to implant a G embryo into his own daughter wasn't random cruelty carried out during an uncontrolled transformation. It reflected the virus's actual biological design, seeking out a host genetically compatible enough to sustain successful reproduction. Her compatibility with the virus made her specifically valuable in a way an ordinary bystander caught in the outbreak never could have been. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what actually happened to her during the crisis. She wasn't simply a child caught in the chaos of her father's transformation. She was, according to the virus's own underlying design, exactly the kind of target G's reproductive strategy was built to seek out. This reframes the entire dynamic between Sherry and her transformed father throughout the outbreak. What remained of William Birkin pursued his own daughter, not out of any recognizable parental instinct twisted by infection, but because the virus driving his behavior was, at its core, still oriented toward finding a compatible host for reproduction. And her genetic compatibility made her exactly that. The essential difference this creates between ordinary viral exposure and G's specific reproductive strategy separates Sherry's ordeal from nearly every other infection case covered throughout this history. Most infected victims represent incidental exposure, someone unlucky enough to encounter a contaminated environment or creature. Sherry represented something the virus was, in a biological sense, actively seeking. Her survival, secured through Claire's protection during the crisis, prevented G's reproductive strategy from succeeding in her specific case. That survival doesn't erase what the virus's underlying design had actually intended for her, a detail that adds a disturbing layer of biological intentionality to an already devastating personal ordeal. Part 24. Why G is one of the most difficult infections to survive. Pulling together everything this section has covered regarding G's specific properties reveals why this particular virus represents such a uniquely difficult biological problem compared to nearly everything else in this history. Its near-continuous mutation, covered earlier, means the infection never settles into a single, studyable state the way T-virus infection generally does. Its reproductive behavior adds a second layer of difficulty beyond simple containment. A virus that spreads only through direct exposure presents one kind of challenge. A virus actively seeking compatible hosts for genetic propagation, the way G does through cases like Sherry's, presents a fundamentally different and more insidious kind of threat. One that doesn't stop mattering once the immediately infected individual has been contained or eliminated. Cellular regeneration compounds both of these problems further. G grants infected tissue an extraordinary capacity to recover from damage that would be fatal under nearly any other circumstance, meaning conventional methods of stopping an infected host, methods that work reasonably well against T-virus zombies, prove considerably less effective against a host actively regenerating faster than damage can accumulate. Producing a stable cure or countermeasure against this combination proved extraordinarily difficult for exactly the reasons already covered. Researchers attempting to study G faced a virus that kept changing its own presentation, actively worked to propagate itself into new hosts, and granted, whatever it did, infect an unusual resistance to the kind of damage that would normally end a threat. Taken together, these properties explain why G represents a fundamentally different biological problem from the T-virus, rather than simply a stronger version of the same underlying threat. Where T created a widespread, relatively predictable outbreak, G created something narrower, but considerably harder to actually stop once it took hold of a compatible host. Part 25. The T-Veronica virus. Alexia's attempt to create a smarter T-virus. Alexia Ashford approached viral research with a goal that separated her work from nearly everyone else covered in this history. Where Marcus and Birkin's creations tended to strip away higher brain function in favor of raw physical mutation, Alexia wanted something that preserved intelligence. A biological weapon capable of retaining meaningful cognitive function, rather than reducing its host to pure instinct. T-Veronica traces its origins back through the same progenitor lineage this history established early on, but Alexia's specific research direction diverged sharply from Umbrella's mainline T-Virus program. Rather than pursuing the Tyrant program's goal of raw combat capability, she pursued something closer to controlled, deliberate evolution, a virus that transformed its host without erasing the mind operating inside that transformed body. This ambition reflects Alexia's own personal history as much as pure scientific curiosity. Tied to her family's declining standing within Umbrella and her father's earlier attempt to restore the Ashford name through genetic experimentation, her research represented a genuinely separate branch within the broader Veronica project, distinct enough from Umbrella's mainline viral work that it deserves treatment as its own lineage rather than simply another T-virus variant. Understanding T-Veronica this way frames it as a direct response to a limitation every earlier virus in this history had struggled with. Where T and even G tended to compromise a host's mind in exchange for physical power, Alexia was chasing something that offered both simultaneously a genuinely different scientific ambition from anything Umbrella's earlier researchers had prioritized. Part 26. Why Alexia spent 15 years in suspended animation. Achieving genuine symbiosis with T-Veronica required more from Alexia than a single successful injection. Her body needed time to adapt gradually to the virus's presence, a process she pursued by placing herself into an extended period of self-imposed stasis, rather than remaining active while her biology worked to accommodate what she'd introduced into it. Umbrella's own material states this directly, confirming that Alexia achieved genuine symbiosis with the virus only after spending 15 years in suspended animation. That length of time separates her approach from nearly every other viral experiment covered throughout this history, most of which produced results within days or weeks, rather than over the course of a decade and a half. This extended stasis reflects a level of patience and long-term planning distinct from the more immediate, often desperate circumstances surrounding other infections this documentary has traced. Birkin's rushed self-injection under pressure from Umbrella's recovery team standing as a particularly sharp contrast. Alexia had the resources, the isolation, and the time to let her transformation unfold gradually, rather than being forced into it by external circumstances. The result of that patience produced something considerably more stable than the volatile transformations this history has covered elsewhere. Rather than losing herself to uncontrolled mutation the way Birkin eventually did, Alexia emerged from her extended stasis with her identity and her intelligence genuinely intact, a direct result of the 15 years her body spent gradually adapting, rather than being overwhelmed all at once. Part 27. Alexander Ashford was Alexia's failed human experiment. Before achieving her own successful symbiosis with T-Veronica, Alexia tested the virus on a human subject closer to her than almost anyone else covered throughout this history, her own father, Alexander Ashford. His injection didn't produce the same controlled result Alexia would eventually achieve for herself, and the difference between his outcome and hers demonstrates exactly how difficult stable T-Veronica integration actually proved to be. Alexander's body couldn't adapt to the virus the way Alexia's eventually did. Rather than achieving anything resembling controlled transformation, his exposure produced catastrophic biological failure, his body twisting into the creature that would eventually become known as Nosferatu, marked by toxic blood and an exposed, visibly compromised heart that made his condition obviously unstable rather than successfully controlled. Umbrella's own material confirms Alexander's identity as the former Ashford family patriarch and identifies his transformation directly as a failed T-Veronica case, distinguishing his outcome clearly from his daughter's eventual success. This distinction matters for understanding T-Veronica's actual danger level. Even among people connected closely enough to Alexia to receive careful, deliberate application of the virus, success wasn't guaranteed. His failure also carries a disturbing personal dimension beyond the pure biology involved. Alexia's own father became a test subject for research his daughter was pursuing. His body left permanently transformed by an experiment that, whatever its scientific ambitions, ultimately treated him the same way Umbrella had treated so many other human test subjects throughout this history, as a resource for testing rather than someone deserving protection from exactly this kind of outcome. Part 28. Steve Burnside retained his mind after T-Veronica infection. Most infections covered throughout this history strip away enough of a host's mind that recognizable, willful behavior becomes rare or impossible once transformation sets in. Steve Burnside's case stands apart from that pattern. Following his own exposure to T-Veronica, he managed something few other infected characters in this franchise ever achieve: regaining enough conscious control to act deliberately, specifically to protect Claire during a critical moment. This partial recovery of agency reflects T-Veronica's underlying design goal, covered earlier in this section, toward preserving intelligence rather than erasing it entirely. Steve's case demonstrates that goal actually working, even if only briefly, and even if ultimately overwhelmed again by the transformation continuing to progress around whatever moment of clarity he managed to hold on to. Umbrella's own material specifically identifies Steve as one of the unusual infected individuals capable of partially regaining control after mutation, distinguishing his case from the far more common pattern this history has traced elsewhere: infected hosts losing themselves entirely and permanently once transformation takes hold. His example represents a genuine, documented exception, rather than a narrative embellishment layered on top of standard infection mechanics. The emotional weight of this moment stems directly from how rare it actually is within this franchise's broader biological history. Watching someone claw back enough of themselves to act with genuine intention, even briefly, against a virus specifically designed to allow exactly that kind of partial retention, connects Steve's personal tragedy directly to T-Veronica's underlying scientific ambition in a way most other infection stories in this history simply don't offer. Part 29. T-Veronica's biggest advantage was preserving intelligence. Placed directly alongside the T-Virus and G-Virus already covered in this history, T-Veronica's core advantage becomes clear immediately. Where T sacrifices nearly all higher brain function in exchange for raw physical mutation, and G pursues genetic reproduction at the expense of the host's stable identity, T-Veronica was built specifically to hold on to intelligence throughout the transformation process, rather than treating cognitive function as an acceptable casualty. Alexia considered this mental preservation essential, rather than incidental, to her broader research goals. A weapon capable of physical transformation without losing the capacity for reasoning, planning, and deliberate action represented something considerably more valuable, from a strategic standpoint, than a mindless creature driven purely by aggression or hunger, the way most T-virus-infected hosts eventually become. This distinction is exactly what makes T-Veronica so dangerous as a potential controlled bioorganic weapons platform. A creature that retains its intelligence can be directed, reasoned within some limited capacity, or trusted to carry out something resembling an actual mission, rather than simply overwhelming whatever happens to be nearby. That controllability represents a genuine strategic advantage over the more chaotic outcomes this history has already traced through Umbrella's mainline viral research. Comparing all three major virus lineages side by side reveals a clear pattern in how differently each researcher approached the same underlying problem. Marcus and Birkin's research prioritized raw biological transformation, power first and control second. Alexia inverted that priority, treating retained intelligence as the actual breakthrough worth chasing, with physical transformation serving that goal, rather than existing as the primary objective on its own. Part 30. T plus G. Umbrella tried combining the T-Virus and G-Virus. Resident Evil Dead Aim introduces an experimental strain that attempts something none of Umbrella's earlier research directly pursued, deliberately combining properties associated with both the T-Virus and the G-Virus into a single, more sophisticated weapon, rather than continuing to develop either lineage separately. This combined project produced a prototype designated T-091. The in-game research documentation covering this project describes both the laboratory work involved and the specific electromagnetic objective researchers were pursuing, details that place TG firmly within documented canon rather than pure speculation, even given how obscure this particular strain remains compared to the mainline viruses this history has already covered extensively. Attempting to merge two viruses this different from each other represented a considerable scientific gamble. T and G pursue fundamentally different biological strategies, covered extensively throughout the preceding sections of this history, and combining their properties into a single coherent weapon required solving compatibility problems neither original virus had ever needed to address on its own. This project's existence demonstrates that Umbrella's research culture, even in its later years, continued experimenting with genuinely novel combinations, rather than simply refining existing formulas indefinitely. TG represents an attempt at biological synthesis, taking established, understood properties from two separate lineages and trying to merge them into something neither original virus could achieve independently. Part 31. T plus G was designed to generate an electromagnetic barrier. The specific goal behind TG's development moves considerably further from anything this history has covered so far. Version 0.9.2 of the research specifically aimed at producing a powerful electromagnetic field around an infected host, a defensive capability entirely unlike the raw physical mutation or genetic reproduction properties driving nearly every other virus covered throughout this video. This objective reframes TG's entire purpose. Rather than simply making a host stronger, faster or more resistant to damage the way most bioorganic weapon research this history has traced tends to prioritize. TG was aimed at turning the infected host's own body into something closer to a defensive technological system, capable of repelling physical attacks through an electromagnetic effect rather than through raw physical durability alone. That ambition represents a genuinely different direction for Umbrella's broader viral weapons program. Every other virus covered throughout this documentary works primarily through biological transformation, mutation, decay, regeneration, or genetic propagation. TG instead pursued something closer to biological engineering, aimed at a specific physics-based defensive property, blurring the line between viral weapon and technological system in a way nothing else in this history quite matches. Whether this specific version ever achieved anything close to its intended electromagnetic effect in practice isn't something the available research material fully clarifies. What's documented is the ambition itself, a genuinely unusual research direction that stands apart from the more straightforward transformation goals driving nearly every other project this documentary has covered. Part 32. Morpheus D. Duvall used T+G to survive a fatal injury. Morpheus Duvall's connection to TG emerges from desperation rather than deliberate research participation, echoing in a different context. The same kind of forced decision Birkin faced years earlier. Badly wounded and facing what should have been a fatal injury, Duvall chose to infect himself with the experimental strain rather than accept death, gambling on an unproven virus as his only remaining option. The resulting transformation produced one of this franchise's stranger human mutations, a combination of effects that don't fully align with either T or G's more established, individually documented properties. Given how experimental and combined TG's underlying design actually was, that unpredictability makes sense. Duvall's body responding to a virus that even Umbrella's own researchers hadn't fully stabilized or understood before he made the decision to use it on himself. Presenting Duvall's transformation honestly means resisting the temptation to invent a tidy biological explanation for every visual or mechanical effect his mutation produces within the game itself. Some of what happens to him reflects the underlying electromagnetic ambition this section has already covered. Other elements simply aren't explained in enough depth by the available source material to support a confident, detailed breakdown. What can be said clearly is that Duvall's case represents a genuine, if narrow, example of TG actually being used on a living human subject, rather than remaining purely theoretical research documentation. His survival, however transformed, offers the clearest evidence available that the combined virus functioned at all, even if the full scope of what it was originally meant to achieve remains only partially demonstrated through his specific case. Part 33. Las Plagas are not viruses at all. Everything covered throughout this documentary up to this point belongs to one broad biological category. Las Plagas breaks from that category entirely. These organisms are parasites, not viruses, a fundamental distinction that separates their entire biological approach from everything this history has traced through Progenitor, T, G, T-Veronica, and TG. Their origin traces back centuries, discovered and eventually sealed away beneath Salazar Castle long before anything resembling Umbrella's modern viral research existed. This ancient timeline places Las Plagas outside the Progenitor lineage entirely, an independent biological threat that predates the modern bioweapons industry this documentary has spent most of its runtime covering. Their ability to inhabit a human host works through a mechanism entirely different from viral infection, rather than invading cells and rewriting genetic material the way T and G both do in their own distinct ways. A Plaga physically integrates with its host's nervous system, controlling behavior through direct neurological connection rather than through cellular mutation spreading through infected tissue. This distinction represents a genuine evolutionary shift in how this franchise's bioweapons developed over time, moving from purely viral mutation toward parasitic control as an entirely separate approach to the same underlying goal, creating dangerous, controllable biological weapons. Understanding Las Plagas as parasites, rather than a virus variant, matters enormously for accurately tracking how this franchise's overall biological history actually branches. Part 34. The Plagas were hidden for centuries before Sadler found them long, before Osmond Sadler ever recovered the Plaga and turned it into a modern weapon. The Salazar family made a deliberate decision to seal the parasites away beneath their own castle, ending a war against an earlier cult built around the same organism, and choosing containment over attempted destruction once that conflict had been won. That decision kept Las Plagas out of human hands for centuries, the organism sitting dormant underground while generations of the Salazar family lived and died without ever releasing what their ancestors had originally sealed away. This timeline places the parasite's true origin well outside the modern bioterrorism era this documentary has spent most of its attention covering. Sadler's eventual rediscovery of the Plaga represents a rediscovery rather than an invention, modernizing and weaponizing something that had already existed and already caused one historical conflict, long before Los Illuminados ever became the organization most players actually encounter. His technological application of the parasite reflects contemporary ambition layered on top of genuinely ancient biological material. Understanding this centuries-long gap matters for placing Las Plagas correctly within this documentary's broader biological timeline. It isn't a byproduct of modern bioterrorism the way most other infections covered throughout this history are. It's an ancient threat that modern bioterrorism eventually found and adapted. A meaningfully different origin story than anything connected to Umbrella's own progenitor-derived research. Part 35. The dominant and subordinate Plaga strains do different jobs. Las Plagas doesn't function as a single, uniform organism applied identically across every infected host. A clear hierarchy exists within the parasite's biology. Dominant strains capable of exerting direct control over subordinate strains, and by extension, over the hosts those subordinate parasites have already claimed for themselves. This command structure gives Los Illuminados a biological mechanism for maintaining control over its infected population beyond simple parasitic integration alone. A host carrying a subordinate Plaga remains subject to influence from anyone controlling a dominant strain, creating a functional chain of command built directly into the parasite's own biology, rather than relying purely on social or religious loyalty to hold the cult's infected followers together. Krauser's own decision to accept a dominant strain specifically, covered in greater depth later in this section, reflects an understanding of exactly this hierarchy. Choosing a dominant Plaga rather than an ordinary subordinate one meant gaining a position of biological control, rather than simply becoming another controlled host within the wider infected population. Focusing on this command structure as a distinct biological feature, separate from the broader religious framework Los Illuminados built around the parasite, clarifies how the cult actually maintained functional control over an entire infected population. The hierarchy isn't simply organizational, it's built directly into which specific strain of Plaga a given host happens to carry. Part 36. Ganados keep their intelligence because of the Plaga, the single biological feature separating Ganados from every T-virus zombie covered earlier in this documentary comes down to exactly how the Plaga interacts with its host's nervous system. Rather than reducing a host to purely instinctive, aggressive behavior the way T-virus infection typically does, Plaga infection allows Ganados to retain meaningful intelligence, language, and the capacity for genuine communication with each other. Umbrella's own material draws this distinction directly, confirming that Ganados lose independent reasoning, the ability to make their own free choices, while still retaining underlying intelligence and communication capability. This isn't a contradiction. It reflects the parasite's specific method of control, taking over the central nervous system's decision-making function, while leaving the cognitive machinery underneath that function largely intact. That preserved cognitive capacity is exactly what makes Ganados coordinate, use tools, and operate as something considerably more dangerous than a shambling crowd of infected villagers. They can plan, communicate warnings to each other, and execute something resembling genuine tactics during an encounter, capabilities no T-virus zombie covered earlier in this documentary has ever demonstrated. Placing this directly against the earlier T-Virus material makes the contrast unmistakable. Two entirely different biological approaches produce two fundamentally different kinds of infected threat. One built around erasing higher function almost entirely, and one built around controlling behavior while leaving the underlying intelligence largely undisturbed underneath that control. Part 37. Plaga infection doesn't affect every human the same way, just as this documentary already established regarding T-Virus outcomes. Las Plagas doesn't produce a single, standardized result across every infected human. Ordinary Ganados represent the most common outcome, but stronger variants and radically mutated bioorganic weapons also emerge from the same underlying parasite, depending heavily on host compatibility and any deliberate experimental modification applied alongside the initial infection. Host compatibility plays a role here similar to the pattern already covered regarding progenitor and T-virus exposure earlier in this history. Some hosts simply respond more strongly to Plaga integration than others, their underlying physiology producing more dramatic transformation than the relatively contained result an ordinary Ganado represents. Deliberate experimental modification compounds this natural variation considerably further. Researchers working with Las Plagas, particularly in the later, more industrialized applications this section will cover shortly, learn to select hosts and apply additional biological interventions specifically to push infection toward more extreme, more militarily useful outcomes, rather than leaving the result purely to whatever a given host's natural compatibility happened to produce. This variation explains why the same underlying parasite eventually produces creatures as different as an ordinary armed Ganado, the towering strength of El Gigante, and the specialized combat adaptations covered later in this section through creatures like the Ganado and the Regenerador. One organism, applied across a wide enough range of hosts and experimental conditions, generates an entire spectrum of outcomes rather than a single fixed result. Part 38. El Gigante is the result of Plaga and genetic manipulation. El Gigante represents one of the more extreme outcomes Las Plagas has produced. A host transformed into something far beyond an ordinary infected villager through the combination of parasitic implantation and deliberate genetic manipulation applied alongside it. This isn't simply a case of unusually strong natural compatibility. It reflects intentional intervention layered on top of the base infection. Umbrella's own material identifies this combination directly, describing El Gigante as the result of Plaga implantation working together with genetic manipulation rather than emerging from parasitic infection alone. That combination produces a creature whose sheer physical scale and strength go well beyond anything an unmodified Plaga host, even an unusually compatible one, would be capable of achieving on its own. The trade-off for this extreme physical enhancement shows up clearly in the creature's mental capacity. Its intelligence suffers severe impairment compared to an ordinary Ganado. The deliberate genetic modification, apparently sacrificing much of the cognitive preservation this section already established as one of the Plaga's more distinctive properties in exchange for raw, overwhelming physical power instead. This trade-off mirrors a pattern this documentary has already traced through Umbrella's earlier viral research. The recurring choice between preserving intelligence and maximizing physical capability showing up again here within an entirely different biological system. Even a parasite specifically noted for preserving cognitive function can have that property deliberately sacrificed once researchers decide raw strength matters more for a specific engineered outcome.